Kirith Sunville had never seen so many species in one place before. The young Valorian diplomat stood at the entrance of Vexor Station's main concourse and felt her hearts beating too fast inside her chest. Her pale blue skin flickered with nervous bioluminescence as she watched the crowds move past her like a river of chaos and danger. Vexor Station was nothing like her homeworld. The Valorians lived in crystal towers surrounded by singing forests and peaceful waters. They spoke softly and touched minds gently and solved their problems with patience and understanding. This place was the opposite of everything she knew. Merchants screamed prices at passing travelers. Armored mercenaries pushed through the crowds with weapons displayed openly on their bodies. Somewhere in the distance, she heard what sounded like fighting, and nobody seemed to care. The air smelled of fuel and sweat and something burnt that she did not want to identify. This was her first solo mission, and she was already questioning whether she was ready for it. Her assignment seemed simple enough when the council gave it to her. 2 factions in the outer territories were threatening war. The conflict would destabilize trade routes and cost millions of lives. Someone needed to bring them to the negotiating table and convince them to find peace. The council chose Kira because she was young and talented, and they believed fresh perspectives could succeed where old methods had failed. Now standing in this place of violence and greed, she wondered if the council had made a terrible mistake. A large figure approached her, and she forced herself not to step backward. The being was a Corthana species, known for their 4 eyes and thick-scaled skin, and their talent for surviving in places where others could not. This one wore the marks of a traitor and carried himself with the careful watchfulness of someone who had seen too much. His name was Dross, and the council had hired him to be her guide. "You are the Valorian diplomat, yes?" he asked in a voice like grinding stones. "I am Kirith Sunvale," she replied, and tried to make her voice sound confident. "Thank you for meeting me." Dross made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Save your thanks until you leave this station alive, little one. Come with me and stay close. There are many here who would see a Valorian as an easy target." They walked through the station, and Kira used her empathic abilities to sense the emotions around her. It was overwhelming. She felt greed and fear and anger and desperation pressing against her mind from every direction. Her people rarely left their homeworld because the galaxy was too loud and too painful for their sensitive minds, but she had trained for this. She built walls inside her thoughts and pushed the noise away and focused on following Dross through the maze of corridors. As they walked, she began to notice something strange. Dross led her through a section where the crowds were thinner and the faces were harder. These were not merchants or travelers. These were killers and criminals and people who had done terrible things. She could feel it in their minds, old violence and fresh cruelty, and the cold emptiness of those who had lost their souls. But even these dangerous beings spoke in whispers about something that frightened them. She caught pieces of conversations as they passed. "Did you hear he was spotted in the Reach last cycle? The Dominion lost 3 ships. They say he walked through the wreckage looking for survivors to save. The slave fleets burned because of him. My cousin was there. He said the human moved like death itself." Human. The word caught her attention. She reached out with her empathic senses toward the speakers and felt something that surprised her. These hardened criminals were genuinely afraid. Not of the station security or rival gangs or the warlords who controlled this sector. They were afraid of a single individual, Dross, she said quietly. "Who are they talking about?" The Corthan's 4 eyes went wide, and he grabbed her arm and pulled her into a quieter corridor. "Do not ask that question loudly," he hissed. "Are you trying to attract attention? I just want to understand." They seemed frightened of someone. A human. Dross looked around nervously before answering. "They call him many names. The Reckoning. The one who walked out of Hellfire, Earth's last nightmare. His real name is spoken carefully because some believe saying it will summon him. Kira felt confused. But humans are a minor species. They only made first contact a century ago. How could one of them frighten people like this? You do not know the stories, Dross said, and his voice dropped even lower. 40 years ago, the Dominion tried to enslave humanity. They thought humans were weak and primitive and would make good servants. They were wrong. The humans fought back with a ferocity that shocked the galaxy. And when the war was over, one human kept fighting. Why? Because the Dominion took his family. Because he escaped from a death pit and spent years hunting slavers across the galaxy. Because he burned the slave fleets and broke the Dominion's expansion and made every criminal and warlord in the sector afraid to touch human colonies. Dross grabbed her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes with all four of his. He's the reason the galaxy respects humanity. He's the reason predators think twice before attacking the weak. He is not a soldier or a warrior in the way you understand. He is something else, something that will not stop ever. Pray you never meet him, little Valorian. Kira wanted to dismiss this as superstition and exaggeration. Surely one being could not be so feared. But she could feel the truth of Dross's fear pressing against her mind, and it made her skin flicker with worried light. They continued to the negotiation chambers, and she tried to focus on her mission. The peace talks began that evening, and they went poorly from the start. One faction called themselves the Crimson Maw, and they arrived not with diplomats but with warships. Their soldiers filled the chamber with weapons drawn, and their leader announced that negotiations were over before they began. We did not come here to talk. The Maw commander declared with a cruel smile on his scarred face. We came to take hostages. Your governments will pay well for your return. Kira felt hands grab her arms and drag her toward the exit. She tried to fight, but she was small and untrained, and these soldiers were professional killers. Her empathic abilities were useless against minds filled with nothing but cold duty. They pulled her through corridors, toward a docking bay where a shuttle waited. She could see other hostages being loaded aboard, and she felt their terror mixing with her own. Then everything stopped. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the edge of the docking bay. He was not impressive to look at. Average height and weathered face and gray streaks in his dark hair. He wore a simple coat with no visible weapons and no armor. He looked tired, like someone who had not slept properly in years. But the Crimson Maw soldiers froze when they saw him. Someone whispered a name, and the word spread through the soldiers like a disease. It is him. Kira looked at the unremarkable figure standing alone against dozens of armed warriors, and she felt the first hint of something impossible. The human had arrived. The Crimson Maw commander laughed when he saw the human standing in the docking bay. It was a loud and ugly sound that echoed off the metal walls and made his soldiers shift nervously. Despite their superior numbers, the commander was a massive being with 4 arms and skin like cracked stone and scars that told stories of 100 battles won through brutality. What is this? He demanded with amusement in his voice. A vagrant has wandered into our operation. Kill him and let us continue. 12 soldiers raised their weapons and aimed at the tired-looking man in the dark. Kira watched from where 2 guards held her arms, and she expected to see the human die. He had no weapons and no armor and no chance against professional killers with plasma rifles. This would be quick and sad, and then she would be taken to whatever fate awaited hostages of the Crimson Maw. The human did not run or beg or even speak. He simply moved. Kira's people were empaths who experienced the world through emotions and connections. They were not warriors, and they did not understand violence. But even she could recognize that what happened in the next 11 seconds was something beyond normal combat. The human flowed between the soldiers, like water through stones. He did not fight them so much as redirect them. The first soldier fired, and the human was already elsewhere, and the plasma bolt struck the second soldier instead. The third soldier swung a blade, and the human guided the swing into a fourth soldier's chest. Weapons were taken from hands and turned against their owners. Bodies were used as shields, and then discarded. He never stopped moving. Every motion served multiple purposes, and every step placed him exactly where he needed to be for the next action. There was no wasted energy and no hesitation and no mercy. In 11 seconds, 12 soldiers were on the ground. Some were dead, and some were dying, and some would never walk again. The human stood among them without a scratch, and he had not drawn a single weapon of his own. The docking bay fell silent, except for the groans of the wounded. Kira felt her heart pounding against her ribs as she tried to understand what she had witnessed. This was not the clumsy violence she had expected from a primitive species. This was something refined and terrible, and perfected over decades of practice. The commander's amusement had vanished. His forearms trembled slightly as he raised a plasma pistol and aimed at the human's chest. "What are you?" he demanded. The human looked at him with eyes that held no anger and no fear and no satisfaction. They were the eyes of someone who had done this so many times that it had become as natural and joyless as breathing. "You know what I am," the human said, and his voice was quiet and rough like stones grinding together. The commander fired. The plasma bolt should have burned a hole through the human's chest. It should have ended this impossible situation and restored order to the universe, but the human moved sideways at the exact moment the trigger was pulled. The bolt passed through empty air, and the human was suddenly beside the commander, and his hand was on the commander's arm, and there was a wet, snapping sound that made Kira's stomach turn. The commander screamed and dropped to his knees. His weapon arm bent in a direction that arms were not meant to bend. The human leaned close and whispered something into the commander's ear. Kira could not hear the words, but she felt their effect through her empathic senses. The commander's mind went from rage to confusion to something she had never expected to feel from such a brutal being: terror. Pure and absolute and overwhelming terror. The commander began to weep. "Please," he sobbed, and his voice cracked like a child's. "Please, I surrender. Take the hostages. Take anything you want. Just let me live." The human released him and stepped back, and the commander collapsed to the floor, still crying. The remaining soldiers threw down their weapons without being asked. They had seen enough. Kira felt the guards release her arms, and she stumbled forward on shaking legs. Around her, the other hostages were being freed by soldiers who moved like they expected death to take them at any moment. Human walked through the chaos without acknowledging any of it. He moved toward the exit like someone finishing a chore, rather than someone who had just defeated an army single-handedly. "Wait," Kira called out before she could stop herself. He paused, but did not turn around. "Thank you," she said. "You saved us. Get your people off this station," he replied without looking at her. "The mall will send more when they learn what happened here. You have maybe 6 hours. Who are you?" This time he did turn. She saw his face clearly for the first time, and she reached out with her empathic abilities to understand the being behind those tired eyes. What she felt made her gasp and step backward. There was no rage in him. There was no bloodlust or cruelty or enjoyment of violence. Those things would have been easier to understand. Instead, she felt something far more terrible: exhaustion, grief that had no bottom and no end, sorrow that had calcified into something harder than stone over decades of loss. And beneath all of that, a love so fierce and so wounded that it had become indistinguishable from pain. This man was not a monster. He was a tragedy that had learned to walk and fight and refuse to die. "Elias Kane," he said, and then he walked away into the shadows of the station. Kira stood in the docking bay surrounded by freed hostages and defeated soldiers, and she could not move for a long Time later that night, she accessed the station's information networks and searched for the name he had given her, Elias Kane, former Earth Defense Force, declared killed in action 40 years ago during the Dominion War. His file showed a young man with bright eyes and a hopeful smile standing beside a woman and a small girl who must have been his family. The official record said he died in a prison camp after watching his wife and daughter sold to slavers, but the unofficial records told a different story. Sightings of a human matching his description appeared across the galaxy for 4 decades after his supposed death, always in places where the worst things were happening, always leaving silence and broken criminal empires in his wake. Had been hunting for 40 years. He had never stopped. Kira closed the files and sat alone in their quarters and thought about what kind of species could produce such a being. Her people were ancient and wise, and they had achieved peace through understanding and empathy. Humans were young and primitive, and they solved their problems with violence. But she had looked into Elias Kane's soul, and she had seen something her people did not possess. A determination that went beyond reason. A refusal to accept the unacceptable that burned like a star that would not die. She understood now why the galaxy whispered his name in fear, and she knew that her mission on this station was not over yet. She told Ross to help the survivors reach safety while she stayed behind to continue her diplomatic mission. The Corthan thought she was insane and told her so in very clear terms. But he could not force her to leave, and eventually he departed with the others. The truth was that diplomacy had nothing to do with her decision to stay. She needed to understand Elias Kane. Her empathic abilities had given her a glimpse into his soul, and what she had seen there haunted her thoughts. How could a being carry so much pain and still function? How could grief become fuel for 40 years of relentless action? What was it about humans that made them capable of such things? She spent hours searching the station for him. Her people's gifts let her sense minds at a distance, and she followed the strange void of his emotions through crowded markets and empty corridors. Most beings radiated feelings like heat from a fire. Elias was different. He was cold and controlled and barely visible to her senses. She finally found him in the forgotten Temple District. This part of the station had been abandoned decades ago when the old religions lost their followers to newer beliefs. The shrines stood empty and covered in dust, and the only visitors were vermin that had made nests in the corners. Elias sat on a broken bench surrounded by small creatures that might have been the station's equivalent of rats. He was feeding them scraps of food from his pocket and watching them eat with something that almost looked like peace on his weathered face. The contrast made Kira stop at the entrance and stare. This was the being who had defeated 12 soldiers in 11 seconds. This was the nightmare that made warlords weep. This was the human whose name was spoken like a curse across the galaxy, and he was feeding vermin in a ruined temple. With the gentleness of someone who had nothing left to fear and nothing left to lose, she stepped forward and he spoke. Without looking up, "You should have left with the others." "I needed to find you," she replied. "Why?" Kira walked closer and sat on a piece of rubble across from him. The small creatures scattered at her approach, but slowly returned when they realized she was not a threat. "Because I looked into your mind in that docking bay. I felt what you feel, and I do not understand how you survive carrying so much pain." Elias was quiet for a long time. He continued feeding the creatures, and his face showed nothing of what he was thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and rough like sand moving over stone. "I do not survive. I just have not died yet. That is not the same thing. No, it is not." He looked at her for the first time since she had arrived. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held depths that seemed to go down forever. "Your people are empaths. You feel what others feel. That must be a burden. Sometimes, Kira admitted. The galaxy is loud and painful for my kind. Most Valorians never leave our homeworld because they cannot bear the noise of so many minds. Then why are you here? Because someone needed to come. Because the council believed peace was possible, and they needed someone willing to try. Because I thought I understood the galaxy well enough to help it. Elias made a sound that might have been a laugh, but held no humor. And now I think I understood nothing. She reached out with her senses and touched the edges of his mind. He did not resist. It was like pressing her hand against ice that had been frozen for centuries. Tell me your story, she said. Tell me how you became what you are. He was silent again, and she thought he might refuse. But then he began to speak, and his words came slowly like water from a crack in a dam. 40 years ago, I was a soldier. Earth had made first contact with the galaxy, and we thought we were joining a community of peaceful civilizations. We were wrong. The Dominion saw us as livestock. They invaded our colonies and took prisoners by the thousands. His hands stopped moving, and the creatures waited patiently for more food. My unit was captured in the third wave. My wife Elena and my daughter Sophie were with me on the colony ship. The Dominion separated families to break our spirits. I watched them take my wife and daughter to a slave transport, and I could do nothing. The soldiers held me down and made me watch. Kira felt his memories pressing against her mind, and she saw fragments of images. A woman with dark hair screaming his name. A small girl crying for her father. Chains and cold ships, and the laughter of cruel beings who saw humans as property. They decided I was too damaged to sell. I had fought back too hard, and they had to break my legs and arms to subdue me. So they threw me in a pit with the other broken ones and left us to die. But you did not die. No. Something in me refused. I cannot explain it better than that. I crawled out of that pit with shattered bones, and I stole a ship, and I started hunting. His voice hardened, and the ice in his mind grew colder. I spent 5 years tracking the slavers who took my family. I learned their networks and their roots and their weaknesses. I freed thousands of slaves, and I destroyed dozens of operations. The galaxy started to notice. They gave me names and whispered stories about the human who would not stop. Did you find them? Your wife and daughter. Elias closed his eyes, and Kira felt something in his mind crack open like a wound that had never healed. I found them. I was 3 days too late. They died in a labor camp on a frozen moon. Elena lasted 2 years before the work killed her. Sophie lasted 3. She was 9 years old. Kira felt tears on her cheeks, and she did not know if they were hers or echoes of his grief. I buried them on that moon. I marked their graves with stones, and I promised them that no one else would suffer like they did. Not if I could stop it. And you have been fighting ever since. 40 years. Thousands of slavers and pirates and warlords. Millions of people freed, and it is never enough. Every time I close my eyes, I see Sophie reaching for me as they dragged her away. Every victim I save has her face. He opened his eyes and looked at Kira, and she saw the terrible truth of him. He was not fighting for justice or revenge. He was fighting because stopping would mean accepting that his daughter's death was final. Every person he saved was another chance to reach her. Every battle was another attempt to be the father who arrived in time. It was beautiful and horrible and utterly human. The Crimson Moa took a colony ship. He said quietly, 300 refugees, including dozens of children. Their leader Sethrak plans to sell them to the highest bidder. That is why I am here. You are going to rescue them alone. I always work alone. Kira stood up and brushed the dust from her clothes. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. Not this time. I am coming with you. Elias looked at her with something that might have been surprise. You are a diplomat. You do not fight. No. But I know how to open doors. I have credentials that can get us onto Sethrak's flagship. You provide the violence. I provide the access. He studied her face for a long moment, and she felt him searching her mind for deception or weakness. What he found must have satisfied him because he finally nodded. You understand that you might die? Yes. And you still want to help. Kira thought about her safe homeworld and her peaceful people and the quiet life she could return to if she walked away now. Then she thought about the children on that colony ship and the parents who were praying for a miracle that might never come. Someone has to try, she said. That is what you taught me today. Someone always has to try, Elias. Cain looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something besides sorrow in his eyes. It was hope. Small and fragile and barely visible, but it was there. The Crimson Throne was a ship built from Nightmare's warlord Sethrak. Had constructed his flagship from the hulls of vessels he had conquered over 3 decades of piracy and terror. The ship was massive and ugly and covered in the marks of 100 battles. It hung in space like a predator waiting for prey, and its weapons could destroy entire fleets. Kira stood in the shuttle, approaching this monster, and she forced herself to breathe steadily beside her. Elias sat motionless with his eyes closed. He had changed into simple clothing that made him look like a servant or a low-ranking assistant. No one would look twice at him. No one would suspect that the tired old human was the most dangerous being in the sector. That was the plan. Kira had used her diplomatic credentials to request a meeting with Sethrak. She claimed that the Valorian Council wanted to discuss trade agreements and possible alliance terms. It was a lie, of course, but Sethrak's arrogance made him believe that even ancient civilizations might seek his favor. The warlord had agreed to meet her on his flagship now. They were flying into the heart of enemy territory with nothing but Kira's status and Elias's skills to protect them. Are you afraid? Elias asked without opening his eyes. Terrified, Kira admitted. But I have learned that fear does not have to stop you from acting. That is a human lesson. Perhaps your species has something to teach the galaxy after all. The shuttle docked, and they were escorted through corridors filled with armed soldiers and cruel-faced pirates. Kira kept her expression calm and her mind shielded. She could feel the malice and greed around her pressing against her senses, but she did not let it show. Sethrak received them in his throne room. The warlord was even more impressive in person than Kira had expected. He stood 8 feet tall, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with orange fire. His body was covered in scars that he wore like medals, and his forearms were each thick with muscle and ending in clawed hands. He sat on a throne made from the bones of his enemies, and he looked at Kira with the hungry interest of a predator examining potential prey. A Valorian diplomat, he said, and his voice rumbled like thunder. Your people have never shown interest in beings like me before. What changed? Kira bowed slightly and began the performance she had rehearsed. The council recognizes power when they see it. Your expansion into this sector has been remarkable. We believe there may be opportunities for mutual benefit. Mutual benefit. Sethrak laughed, and the sound made the walls vibrate. Your people have nothing I want except perhaps your pretty glowing skin. Maybe I will take that as a trophy. His court laughed with him, and Kira felt Elias tense slightly beside her. She needed to buy time. Somewhere on this ship 300 hostages waited for rescue. Elias needed to find them and free them before Sethrak realized what was happening. We have information, Kira said smoothly. Trade routes and defense schedules and the locations of unprotected colonies. Knowledge is valuable even to one as powerful as yourself. Sethrak leaned forward with new interest in his burning eyes. Perhaps you are not as useless as I thought. Speak more of this information. Kira began describing invented intelligence while her mind reached out through the ship. Her empathic abilities could sense the emotions of beings at a distance, and she searched for the fear and despair of captives there. Below them and to the left, She felt hundreds of terrified minds huddled together in darkness. Children crying for parents and parents praying for miracles. She sent a tiny pulse toward Elias and felt him receive it. He knew where to go now. "Your bodyguard seems restless," Sethrak observed suddenly. "Why does a diplomat need protection anyway?" "Are you afraid of me, little Valorian?" "He is merely a servant," Kira said. "A porter for my luggage. Humans are useful for menial tasks. Yes, I have heard they make acceptable slaves when properly broken. Perhaps I will add him to my collection." Elias kept his head down and his expression blank. He was playing the role perfectly. Kira continued talking, and the minutes crawled past. She invented stories about Valorian politics and made promises she would never keep, and watched Sethrak's greed grow with every word. Meanwhile, she felt Elias slip away from her side so smoothly that no one noticed his absence. He was moving through the ship now. She could sense the void of his emotions traveling downward toward the captives. 10 minutes passed. Then 20 Sethrak's attention began to wander, and Kira felt the first hints of suspicion forming in his mind. Something was wrong, and the warlord's instincts were warning him. "Where is your servant?" he asked. Suddenly, Kira felt ice form in her stomach. "I believe he went to check on our shuttle. He worries about the equipment. I did not give him permission to leave, guards. Find the human and bring him to me." Soldiers hurried from the room, and Kira knew their time had run out. She needed to stall longer, but Sethrak was already rising from his throne with anger building in his eyes. "You are lying to me, Valorian. I can smell deception on your skin. What is your servant really doing on my ship?" Before Kira could respond, she felt something through her empathic senses that made her gasp. Elias had found the hostages, and he had also found the guards protecting them. The emotion she sensed from that part of the ship went from boredom to confusion to terror to nothing at all in a matter of seconds. Then, the lights went out. Emergency power flickered, uncasting everything in red shadows. Alarms began screaming through the ship, and Sethrak roared orders at his soldiers. "Find him, kill him. Bring me his head." Squads of warriors rushed into the darkness, and Kira stood alone in the throne room surrounded by the warlord's personal court. She could feel Elias moving through the ship like a ghost. He left silence and unconscious bodies in his wake, and the fear spreading through. Sethrak's forces grew with every passing moment. Reports came back to the throne room, and each one was worse than the last. "Squad 3 is not responding. We found Squad 7. They are all dead. We never heard them fire their weapons. Something is blocking our sensors. We cannot track him. The hostages are moving toward Shuttle Bay 3. He has freed them somehow." Sethrak's rage filled the throne room like a physical force. The warlord grabbed Kira by the throat and lifted her off the ground with one massive hand. "What have you done?" he screamed. "Who is that human?" Kira could not breathe, but she managed to smile. "His name is Elias Kane." The effect was immediate. Sethrak's grip loosened, and his burning eyes went wide with recognition, and something she had never expected to see in such a powerful being. "Fear. That is impossible," the warlord whispered. "He is a legend, a story to frighten children. He is very real, and he is coming for you." As if summoned by her words, the doors to the throne room exploded inward, and Elias walked through the smoke and debris. His simple clothing was torn and stained with blood that was not his own. His eyes were cold and focused and absolutely merciless. He held a data chip in one hand, and he tossed it to Kira, who caught it reflexively. "The hostages are on shuttles heading to safety," he said. "This contains evidence of Sethrak's crimes. Enough to bring down his entire organization." Sethrak dropped Kira and bellowed at his guards. "Kill him, all of you. Kill him now." 50 of the deadliest warriors in the warlord's empire surged forward with weapons. Raised Elias looked at Kira, and she saw something in his eyes that made her chest ache. It was acceptance. The quiet peace of someone who had known for a long time that this moment would come. "Get to the shuttle bay," he said softly. "I will buy you time. I am not leaving you. You have to. Someone needs to survive, to tell the truth about what happened here. Someone needs to make sure his empire falls. Elias, go. Please." The guards were almost upon them, and Kira made the hardest decision of her life. She ran, but not toward the shuttle bay. She ran to the side of the throne room, where shadows offered cover, and she watched as 50 warriors crashed against one tired human like a wave against a cliff, and the cliff did not move. Kira had thought she understood violence after watching Elias defeat 12 soldiers in the docking bay. She had been wrong. What happened in Sethrak's throne room was something beyond her ability to comprehend. It was not a battle so much as a demonstration of what determination could accomplish when it had been refined by 40 years of grief and practice. Elias moved through the guards like wind through grass. He did not try to kill them all because that would have been impossible even for him. Instead, he created chaos. He redirected attacks so that soldiers struck each other. He used the environment as a weapon. He broke formations and shattered morale and turned 50 trained killers into a confused mob. But there were too many, and he was only human. Kira watched from the shadows as cuts and bruises accumulated on his body. She saw him slow down as exhaustion and injury took their toll. He was winning, but the cost was destroying him piece by piece. She had to do something. Her people were pacifists. They had renounced violence generations ago because their empathic abilities made them feel the pain of everyone around them. Fighting meant experiencing the suffering of both victim and attacker, and no Valorian could endure that burden. But there was another way. The old text spoke of a forbiddance technique that had been abandoned when her people chose the path of peace. It was called emotional projection, and it allowed an empath to push feelings into other minds rather than just receiving them. The technique had been used in ancient wars to break enemy morale, and it had been sealed away because of the psychological damage it caused to both the user and the targets. Kira had never been trained in this ability. She had only read about it in historical archives that warned against ever attempting such things. She reached into her own mind and gathered every memory of pain and loss she had absorbed from Elias. His grief at losing his family, his decades of lonely hunting, his exhaustion and his sorrow, and his desperate love that would not let him rest. Then she pushed. The effect hit the guards like a physical blow. Suddenly, they were not just fighting a single human. They were experiencing his lifetime of suffering through their own minds. They felt what it was like to watch their families taken away. They felt the cold of the death pit and the fire of determination that had pulled him out. They felt 40 years of violence and loss compressed into a single moment of overwhelming anguish. Half of them collapsed immediately. Their minds could not handle emotions that intense, and they simply shut down. Others stumbled backward with tears streaming from their eyes and dropped their weapons because holding them suddenly felt obscene. The remaining guards fled. They ran from the throne room screaming about demons and curses and the human who carried death in his soul. Kira fell to her knees as the backlash of her projection tore through her own mind. She had felt everything she had pushed into those guards, and it was almost too much to bear. But she stayed conscious. She had to see what happened next. Elias stood alone in the center of the throne room, surrounded by fallen enemies. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds and breathing hard in his body. Swayed like a tree in a storm, Sethrak emerged from behind his throne. With murder in his burning eyes, the warlord had not been affected by Kira's projection. His mind was too alien and too shielded and too consumed by his own rage to be touched by human emotions. Impressive, Sethrak growled as he advanced on Elias. You truly are everything the stories say, but stories end. And you are just one old human with broken bones and tired muscles. I'm going to tear you apart with my own hands. Elias raised his fists and faced the towering warlord without Backing down. The fight that followed was brutal and one-sided, but not in the way Sethrak expected. The warlord was stronger and faster and better armed. He had 4 arms and claws like knives and centuries of combat experience. He landed blow after blow on Elias, and each impact should have ended the battle. But Elias would not fall. Every time Sethrak knocked him down, he got back up. Every time the warlord broke something, Elias kept fighting with whatever still worked. He was outmatched in every possible way, and it did not matter because losing was simply not something he was capable of accepting. Sethrak drove his claws into Elias's shoulder, and the human grabbed the warlord's arm and used it as leverage to deliver a strike to Sethrak's throat. The warlord threw Elias across the room, and the human crashed into the wall and slid to the floor. And then he stood up and came forward again. "Why will you not die?" Sethrak screamed with something like fear entering his voice for the first time. Elias did not answer with words. He answered by attacking again, with blood streaming down his body and his legs barely supporting his weight. Kira understood then what made humans truly terrifying to the galaxy. It was not their strength, or their intelligence, or their technology. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat. They could be broken and beaten and left for dead, and they would still find a way to keep going. There was no scenario where a human would simply give up. There was no amount of pain that would make them stay down. Sethrak was powerful enough to destroy armies, but he had never faced anything like this. He was fighting a being that had already accepted death 40 years ago, and feared nothing that came after the warlord made a mistake. He overextended on a killing blow, and Elias stepped inside his guard and grabbed one of the ceremonial blades from Sethrak's own belt. In a single motion, he drove the blade up through the soft flesh under Sethrak's jaw and into his brain. The warlord's burning eyes went dark, and his massive body collapsed to the floor. Elias stood over him for a moment, and then his legs finally gave out, and he fell. Kira ran to his side and cradled his head in her lap. His wounds were severe, and his breathing was shallow, and his skin had gone pale from blood loss. "You did it," she whispered. "The hostages are safe. Sethrak is dead. His empire will fall." Elias opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "It was peace, thank you," he said softly. "Seeing me, not the story they tell about me. The real me. Do not talk like this is goodbye. We need to get you to medical care. There is a shuttle bay 2 corridors to the left. The hostages should have left ships behind. Get yourself out of here before his lieutenants realize what happened. I am not leaving without you. You have to. Someone needs to tell the truth. Someone needs to make sure his victims get justice. Someone needs to." He stopped talking, and his eyes closed, and Kira felt a surge of terror through her connection to his mind. But he was still alive. Barely. His heart was still beating, and his will was still holding on to life with the same stubbornness that had carried him through 40 years of impossible battles. Kira was small and Elias was heavy, but she managed to drag him through the corridors to the shuttle bay. She loaded him onto a ship and launched him into space. Just as the Crimson Throne began tearing itself apart in a power struggle between Sethrak's surviving lieutenants, she flew toward the nearest station with medical facilities, and she prayed to gods she had never believed in to keep one tired human alive. 3 weeks later, Kira stood before the Valorian Council and delivered her report on what had happened at Vexor Station and aboard the Crimson Throne. She told them about Elias King and his 40-year mission, and his refusal to stop fighting for people who had no one else to save them. The council listened in silence, and when she finished, they looked at her with new respect. "You have changed," the eldest counselor observed. I have learned, Kira replied. Our people chose peace because we believe that violence only creates more violence. But I have seen what happens when no one is willing to fight for the helpless. Sometimes, peace requires someone willing to stand in the darkness so others can live in the light. And this human, he survived his wounds. He did. The doctors said it was impossible, but he healed faster than they expected. I think he has forgotten how to die. Kira returned to her quarters after the meeting and found a message waiting for her. It was text only with no return address, and the words were simple. Thank you for seeing me. Not the story, me. I'm heading to the frontier. There are reports of slavers operating near the colony worlds. The fight continues. If you ever need me, look for the places where things are worst. That is where I will be. She smiled and saved the message and looked out her window at the stars. Somewhere out there a tired human was still fighting. Still refusing to stop. Still saving people who had no one else. The galaxy whispered his name in fear, but Kira knew. The truth now, Elias Kane was not a monster, or a legend or a weapon. He was simply a man who loved his family. So much that losing them had broken something fundamental in his ability to give up. And that broken piece had become the most dangerous thing in the universe, not because of what it could destroy, but because of what it refused to let die on a distant station at the edge of explored space. A group of pirates gathered in a hidden base to plan their next raid. They had heard rumors of a convoy carrying valuable cargo, and they intended to take it by force. One of them burst through the door with panic on his face. We have to leave, he gasped. Now, right now. What are you talking about? A human was seen in the sector. Old guy with gray hair and a dark coat. He's asking questions about slaver activity. The leader of the pirates laughed nervously. So what? One human against all of us. You do not understand.